It's strange, isn't it? Some people go through a breakup, cry for a few months, and eventually move on. Some people lose a friendship they've had for years and somehow find peace with it. Some people watch an entire chapter of their life collapse and still manage to build a new one. But others, they stay stuck, not for weeks, not for months, sometimes for years. And maybe that's you. Maybe there's someone you haven't spoken to in a long time, yet they still show up in your thoughts. Maybe there's a mistake you made years ago, and somehow it still feels unfinished. Maybe there's a version of your life you can't stop imagining. A version where things worked out differently. A version where you said the right thing, made the right choice, didn't let them go. And every now and then, your mind drifts back there. Not because you want it to, because it happens automatically. While driving, while showering, while trying to fall asleep at 2 a.m. Suddenly, you're not in the present anymore. You're somewhere in the past, reliving a moment that's already over. And the question is, why? Why do some people never truly move on? Most people think the answer is simple. They assume you're attached to a person, a relationship, a memory. But psychology suggests something much deeper. Because most of the time, you're not attached to what happened. You're attached to what almost happened. Think about that. The relationship that ended isn't always what hurts the most. Sometimes it's the future you imagined with that person. The plans, the possibilities, the life that existed only inside your mind. When someone leaves, you don't just lose them. You lose the future version of yourself that existed with them. And that's where things become complicated. Because the human brain struggles with unfinished stories. It always has. Have you ever noticed how a movie with no ending stays in your head longer than one with a perfect conclusion? Or how unanswered questions seem impossible to ignore? There's a reason for that. Your brain is constantly trying to create meaning. It wants resolution. It wants closure. It wants the story to make sense. And when it doesn't, part of your mind keeps returning to it. Again, and again, and again. Not because you're weak, not because you're broken, because your brain hates uncertainty. But here's where most people get trapped. They spend years believing they need closure before they can move on. One last conversation, one last explanation, one last apology, one last chance to understand what really happened. And so they wait. Sometimes, without realizing it, they wait for a message, a sign, an answer, something that will finally allow them to let go. But what if that answer never comes? What if the apology never happens? What if the person who hurt you never explains themselves? What then? Does your life stay paused forever? This is where everything changes. Because the people who move on aren't necessarily the people who get closure. They're the people who stop needing it. That sounds impossible at first, because we've been taught that healing comes from understanding. But often, healing comes from acceptance. Acceptance that some questions will remain unanswered. Acceptance that some stories end without a satisfying conclusion. Acceptance that life does not always provide explanations. And strangely enough, the moment you accept that, something begins to loosen. Because you stop chasing answers. You stop negotiating with the past. You stop trying to rewrite events that can no longer be changed. And for the first time, your attention returns to the present. Now here's the twist. Many people believe moving on means forgetting, but that's not true. Moving on doesn't mean erasing memories. It doesn't mean pretending something never mattered. It doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. In fact, the strongest people often remember everything. They simply stop letting those memories control their future. The memory stays, the lesson stays. Sometimes, even the sadness stays. But the grip loosens, and that's the difference. Because moving on isn't an event, it's a decision. A decision you make repeatedly. Every time your mind drifts backward. Every time regret tries to pull you into another imaginary timeline. Every time you find yourself replaying a story that's already over. You choose to return, not to the past, to your life, to this moment, to the chapter that hasn't been written yet. And maybe that's what most people misunderstand. Maybe the goal was never to stop remembering. Maybe the goal was never to stop caring. Maybe the goal was simply to stop living in a place you can no longer change. Because no matter how many times you revisit yesterday, it will never become tomorrow. And perhaps the reason some people never move on isn't because they're holding on to the past. It's because they're still waiting for the past to become different. But it won't. And that's not a tragedy. That's freedom. Because the moment you stop asking the past to change, you finally give yourself permission to change instead. And that might be the first real step toward moving forward.